Hi guys, so in the previous lecture we talked briefly about how the default parameters can be passed to a function in es6, and we will be pretty much using the same discussion and moving it ahead with default parameters and having expressions used in the default parameters. And perhaps the most interesting feature of default parameter values is the default value need not be a primitive value. You can execute a function to retrieve the default parameter value. So as you can see on the screen, I have created a very small example where you have a get value function. You can just return anything, or it could be a computation, and I have an add function which is adds first and the second, and of course it just returns the first and the second. So if you call the function with add 1 comma 1, it will use 1 2 and it will give you an answer of 2. Similarly, if you do an add of 1, the default parameter or second value which this will be generated, and you can get the total value of 6. So here, if the last argument isn't provided, the function get value will be called in and it will retrieve the default value. Now keep in mind that get value is only called when add is called without a second parameter, not when the function declaration is first passed. Now that means if get value were written differently, it could potentially return a different value. For example, you can just write, let's move this instead of let's make it my value, which is the initial value that we can give of 5, and every time this gets called, this will become my value plus plus. So the first time it gets called, it will be 5, and the next time it gets called, it should be 6. So the total should be 7. You can see 2, 6 and 7. Now be careful when you are using function calls as default parameter values, because if you forget the parentheses, let's say for example, instead of get value, you just do a get value. Let me just close this one at least. Now in this case, what will happen is you're passing a reference to the function rather than the result of the function call. So you can see that it returns function get value. It adds to it. So be careful when you're doing that. Now this behavior introduces another interesting capability. You can use a previous parameter as a default to the later parameter. Here, let's see an example. So let me first revert this to a get value. Now what I can do is, instead of using second, what I can do is I can call it as a first. Now what will happen is, if I don't give the value, the first argument itself will be taken, and that's the reason you see the answer 2, 2, 2. Let's say I make this as a 2. In this case, it should be 4. You can see 2, 2, 4. So in this scenario, the second parameter is given the default value of the first, meaning that passing is just one argument leaves both the arguments to be the same. So if you call add 1, 1 or add 1, it's going to be the same thing. Now we can also play along with this and probably update it. So instead of calling get value of nothing and just using the my value, I can pass in a parameter here saying, instead of this my value, comment it out, you pass a my value and add some number to it, let's say 2, and instead of assigning it to first, you can just do a get value and pass the first argument as the value. So in this scenario, you'll call 1, so this will be 1, and you pass 1, so 1 plus 2 is 3, and this was 1, so the answer should be 4. Similarly, the moment you call with a 2, this would be 2, and the second argument, which is get value of 2, it will be 2 plus 2, 4, and this 2 is 2 itself, so it's 6. So you can also play around, and the ability to reference parameters from default parameter assignment works only on previous arguments. So let's say if you want to change the order, so instead of doing let me actually just comment this out and write it again, because I'm sure many of you will refer to this code pen. So this was first, right, the previous example. So now instead of doing second equals to first, if you just do a second and say first is equal to second, this will not work. Now if you want to make the call again, let's say you pass in an undefined comma 1. In this scenario, you're passing an undefined and a 1. However, the second is not yet initialized, and first tries to use the value of second. So this will not work. So if you have any values that you want to be defaulted, I would recommend that you move it always at the end of the function, which means at the last parameters. So that was a little brief about how you can use default parameters and have expressions in the default parameters. Of course, you can play along and try to modify the example as much as you can. And let me know if you have any questions around how things happen and why things happen in the question and answer section, or probably in the comments below. I'll see you in the next class.